for the body of work that we've already looked at, I want to shift gears and talk about a text that I alluded to that we haven't looked at and that most people haven't looked at, and that's Wakefield. It's 9 pages long. Okay, so anybody can read it if you've got a spare half an hour. What's it about? It's about the most ordinary people and the most extraordinary events of any text that I know of. And I'll tell you the plot in one sentence. An ordinary pedestrian figure, he's called that. An ordinary man, what is it I think Hawthorne says about him? The man in London surest to perform nothing today which should be remembered tomorrow. This man, who is happily married, he's been married for 10 years, tells his wife that he's leaving on a short trip. He goes out of that house, he rents a flat a few blocks away, he stays in that flat for 20 years to spy on his wife and to see the impact that he has had. And the story closes with his return. It closes with him at the threshold of going back home. That's about all that's in the story. 9 pages, and that's what happens. Hawthorne's narrator claims to have heard this story somewhere. This story is radically different from anything we've looked at. There's nothing Puritan here. Nothing in the past. The story is set in London, as a matter of fact, which is one reason that a lot of the American studies critics don't deal with it, because it's not about American culture, at least in any direct sense. There's no romance here. You don't have any scarlet A. You don't have any black veil. You don't have any of that sort of clanking machinery of semiosis that we have talked about in the other texts. You don't have the kind of masquerade that you had in my kinsman Major Molyneux. You don't have hidden secrets that we know of in this text. There seems to be no psychology in it. It's lean. It's sparse. It's tough. It's a strange, strange story. So I want to read you the way Hawthorne closes it. He gives it a moral. He calls it that. I'm going to give it a moral, he says. And he closes it like this. It's an interesting conclusion. Amid the seeming confusion of our mysterious world, individuals are so nicely adjusted to a system, and systems to one another, and to a whole, that by stepping aside for a moment, as Wakefield did, opting out, a man exposes himself to a fearful risk of losing his place forever. Like Wakefield, he may become, as it were, the outcast of the universe. That's the way Hawthorne closes the story, or the narrator does. Wakefield is the outcast of the universe. He's not just left his wife, but he has left all of those routines and systems that make up his world. He's fallen out of the universe. He's exiled from reality. And this is a cautionary statement about the lack of success he's likely to have getting back in. That's what this text tells us. What do we make of the text? Well, one way to think about this text, when you think about this strange character who's described as nondescript, phlegmatic is a word that Hawthorne uses for him, limited, ordinary, forgettable, and also a bit ghost-like, unreal, insubstantial. One thing that I think comes across is that in some ways he reminds us of Hawthorne, of what we know Hawthorne felt about himself. Hawthorne spent those 10 years in seclusion, reading books. One feels that he could have spent 100 years in seclusion, reading books. He married Sophia Peabody from a very prominent Peabody family, in fact, a family of social activists. He married her, and he always said that this marriage allowed him, I quote, to open an intercourse with the world. That Sophia had a kind of confidence and a kind of this world orientation that was crucial for him. And you get the sense that otherwise he might have remained somewhere on the margins, in a closet, in a library. He writes frequently in his journals and diaries about his sense of feeling unreal, ghost-like, insubstantial. And I think this is the text that is closest to that. This text has no Gothic dimensions of ghostliness, nobody in white sheets, nobody haunting houses in that sense. So we have to ask the question, why does Wakefield leave? That's, of course, the question that the text never says anything about. The moral that I cited gives you the conclusion. It says he's the outcast of the universe. It doesn't say why he left. It just describes what his fate is. Why does a man walk out of a good marriage after 10 years and spend 20 years in a flat around the corner checking out his wife? Well, there are a lot of possible answers. One of them is midlife crisis. 10 years is enough. He wants out. God knows that's a familiar scenario. Okay? 10 years is longer than many marriages last. So therefore, you could claim he leaves for the most evident kinds of reasons. The only problem with that explanation is that we don't know anybody else who gets a flat a few blocks away and spends 20 years there. If we were just opting out of a marriage, if that were the problem, then he'd be long gone. There'd be no story, not this story. So that won't take us far enough. There has to be more to it than that if he's going to stay there. One explanation that some of the critics have come up with, there's not much criticism of this text. One explanation is that, and this one I think has a lot of credibility to it, he's one hell of a sadist. After all, that's quite a trick to play on your wife. To walk out, she will of course think, as she does think, that he is dead, and to spend 20 years there having your little spying game on her. Is it an effort to control her? Is it an effort to check her out to see that she doesn't misbehave? An effort to punish her? It is punitive. It seems like a nasty trick. She does what happens after, first of course she just assumes he's delayed or whatever, and then she becomes ill. And he sees it because he's watching. He sees doctors coming into the house. You'd think that he would at that point break his little contract and go in, but he doesn't. He watches. It's written about this way. Dear woman, will she die? By this time, Wakefield is excited to something like energy of feeling. As I've said, he's a bit sluggish, so it takes the sight of doctors coming into his own house for the blood to flow a little bit. He's excited to something like energy of feeling, but still lingers away from his wife's bedside, pleading with his conscience that she must not be disturbed at such a juncture. That's what the narrator says. He doesn't want to disturb her. Of course, she is disturbed because he's not there. Hawthorne adds, if aught else restrains him, he does not know it, suggesting that he's got other motives too, but they're unknown to him even. Now remember the story of the minister's black veil. The Reverend Hopper becomes totally incognito, puts a veil permanently on his face, and withdraws from his engagement, as if being true to his own spiritual identity meant exiting any kind of social or sexual arrangements. Something figural is happening in this text as well. There's a meeting that is staged. It's literally staged by Hawthorne. It starts this way. Now for a scene. This is after the two of them have been separated for years. Hawthorne is going to tell us of an encounter. It's a perfect urban scene. Got a crowd of people. You've got a woman who thinks and has thought for some time, knows from her point of view that her husband is dead. And you've got a man who has been watching her every day for years, knowing that that's what she thinks, and of course knowing that it's not true. Now for a scene, amid the throng of a London street, we distinguish a man, now waxing elderly, with few characteristics to attract careless observers, yet bearing in his whole aspect the handwriting of no common fate. For such is the skill who have the skill to read it. He is meager, his low and narrow forehead is deeply wrinkled, his eyes small and lusterless, sometimes wander apprehensively about him, but oftener seem to look inward. He bends his head and moves with an indescribable obliquity of gait, as if unwilling to display his full front to the world. Watch him long enough to see what we have described, and you will allow that circumstances, which often produce remarkable men from nature's ordinary handiwork, have produced one such here. Now, leaving him to sidle along the footwalk, cast your eyes in the other direction, where a portly female, considerably in the wane of life, with a prayer book in her hand, is proceeding to yonder church. She has the placid mien of settled widowhood. Her regrets have either died away or have become so essential to her heart that they would be poorly exchanged for joy. Just as the lean man and the well-conditioned woman are passing, a slight obstruction occurs and brings these two figures directly in contact. Their hands touch. The pressure of the crowd forces her bosom against his shoulder. They stand face to face, staring into each other's eyes. After a 10-year separation, thus Wakefield meets his wife. It's an astonishing sequence. Think about the way the two of them look. She is placid. She has accepted the fact that he's dead. He, of course, he's described as a very tormented, anguished figure with eyes that look inward because he's been living with this drama every day. Is there not recognition there? They both seem, of course, he knows who she is, but she doesn't know who he is. And yet she has the sense that I've seen this man before. She was married to him for 10 years, but 10 years have gone by. He has gone inward. That's what the line says. Oftener seem to look inward. He has a strange gait. This story's going to be about where he's been, why he's been there. Some people have said, no, this is not a sadistic story, it's a love story. That he loves her more by dint of having left her. Now, you're going to have to do a lot of turn a few corners to understand this one, but think about it. He did leave in order to, we have to assume this, I mean, you've got to assume that he's not obliged by the police to stay in town. He has elected to get this apartment a few blocks away. He has elected to spend his time looking at her. So he still is very much committed to her in some strange fashion. And so the argument goes, in fact, he can love her best by not being there, by watching her, by making this a spectacle for himself, by not being physically in the way. Now that's an argument. It's not one that you may want to agree with. All of this has to do with why this man left. I mean, that would be one reason, wouldn't it? That would be one plausible reason why he left. That's, of course, what the text won't tell us. This is Hawthorne's greatest teaser, this text. It's like Bartleby in that regard of Melville. What relationship matters to this man? That reading I just suggested, and the sadistic reading, say that you've got to look for the relationship between him and his wife. That's what it's about. Whether he wants to hurt her or whether he wants to love her, it's still about the same thing. The language of the text at one point says this when he is away in his apartment. It says, it's about figuration. It says that figuratively he is always beside his wife and at his hearth, yet must never feel the warmth of the one nor the affection of the other. Figuratively, in his mind, he's at home and with her, but not literally, not really, not physically. What does that mean, to be figuratively somewhere in your mind rather than being really there? It's all about absence and presence. It's about how we can be physically somewhere and yet distracted, in some sense vacant, and how by intensity of thinking there can be a kind of presence and a kind of reality to something wherever we really are. But I want to change the terms of this now. I think that the logic that this story is about the relationship between him and his wife is wrong-headed. I don't think it tells us what we want to know. I read this story, and the reason I like this story, as a kind of parable about a man's relationship to himself. And I'm going to use some of the same points that I just made. He goes away and spies on, now we have been saying he spies on her. Let's change that. He spies on his absence. He spies on the spot he has vacated. He spies on the sort of figure where he was. You can imagine, for example, someone who becomes most real to themselves if they can look at their footprints, or if they can look at the bed they just got up from and they can see the mussed up sheets and they can say, yes, I was there. And I'm thinking back again to Hawthorne's ghostliness, his insubstantiality, his sense that he's not quite real. Now, the credibility of this lecture depends on your willingness to acknowledge that that might be possible. That I don't know whether all of you have a 100% sense of reality all the time about yourselves or whether you don't. This argument depends on people having occasionally, and unfortunately sometimes less than often, the sense that they're unreal, that they're ghosts, that they're flitting through life, that there's nothing substantial or authentic about them, about their conditions, about who they are. I think this text is about a rather fascinating, desperate, absurd effort to possess yourself, self-possession. How would you go about doing that? And it seems to me that that is what this little story shows us. Think about the other Hawthorne texts that we've looked at. We've got on the one hand characters that are in some sense ghostly, and we've got on the other hand those scrutinizing characters. Characters, for example, and you can see Dimmesdale and Chillingworth like this. Dimmesdale, by dint of being a liar, becomes unreal to himself, and Chillingworth, who is there fixated on Dimmesdale like a vampire, trying to get to him, get his secret, get on the inside of him. That is a duo. It's a model that requires someone looking, sucking, and someone else there being looked at and sucked. What if you collapse it into one? What if you imagine that as the condition of your own life, of one person's life, trying to penetrate himself, trying to understand, get a hold of, get possession of, grasp himself? What I want to say there is that that's what in life we can't do. Whoever has had a full sense of who they are? It takes other people to tell us who we are. Can anyone see the figure that they make in life? And one reason you can't see it is because you're making it. You're in the way. You're there. You are impeding it. We can't take an aerial photograph of ourselves. We can look at photographs that others have taken. We can hear stories that others tell us about ourselves. And of course we have our inner testimony, but it is always biased testimony. It, by definition, can have no objective sense of the shape we make, the figure we make. This story is about those matters, and I'm trying to argue that those are absolutely meat and potatoes matters. They may sound exotic and esoteric, but they're not. I think it's one of the basic drives in life, which is to possess oneself, to become real to oneself, to see who one is. I suggest that we're, for the most part, constitutively in the dark about those issues, to see one's life, to see the figure that you make. And the logic of this story is that you have to exit your life in order to possess it. He moves out in order to see the shape that he has left. What this tells us is that self-possession, which if we are lazy we think, well, it just means stand in the mirror a few minutes or write a journal and take care of that one. If you really think about it, you're always in the way when you're trying to get your own books kept. It's to say that your own bias, your own angle, is always sort of obtruding. It's there. How could you possibly get around it? So what this text tells us is that we are other unto ourselves. Now that's quite a statement, because it's easy to think, we all know, that other people are other. We know that the rest of the world, in some sense, is composed of ghosts. I mean, we know that if we touch them, they've got flesh, and we know that we can love them, and we can hate them, and we can take pictures of them. But most people sort of have a basic sense that they are real, and the rest are sort of phantoms. I mean, that's what we're unfortunately doomed to, that view of things. This text says we are unreal to ourselves as well. It's not just that others can't be known, we can't know ourselves either. It's a radical text, it seems to me, in that regard. And therefore, I think it prefigures much 20th century literature. It prefigures the massive book of Proust, À la recherche du temps perdu, Remembrance of Things Past, which is many thousand pages about a man trying to come into self-possession. This little 9-page story, it seems to me, gets across the same thing. But it's not just Proust. This story looks to Kafka. Kafka's questers, the man who wants to get into the castle, the person who's having the trial. That sense, because this has the sense of a pilgrimage. This man making figural moves in order to somehow come home, which is what he does at the end. He finally comes home. He crosses that threshold. He is Rip Van Winkle once again, 20 years absence, coming home. But unlike Rip Van Winkle, this man has been watching it, savoring it, every day of those 20 years. He has been a spectator of the only show in town, which is himself, his own life. But he's been able to have front row seats because he left home. It's a very, very weird story. We are other unto ourselves. This is consonant with modern psychology. It's consonant with the idea that the unconscious is what we can never know about ourselves, even if it regulates and governs our life. It's also consistent with the idea that the most important things about us get actualized, get expressed in ways beyond our control, beyond our knowledge. And I think all of us have some faint sense that that's the way we work. I want finally to say that this is a story that, though it's very short, is remarkably ambitious. It's a story of what I'd like to call Faustian reach. And I'm going to quote my favorite critic, it's myself. It goes like this, that this man, Wakefield, is our contemporary. That Hawthorne has given us a story, as I said, of Faustian reach, that the sluggish Wakefield lives twice. He becomes, in every sense of the word, a proprietor of his life. The changes of clothing, because he dons a disguise, and apartment seem materialist, but the venture is spiritual. And he lives out every writer's dream, to see life, to espy its shape, to possess its core. And he does it in ways that are shockingly, I think, parallel to today's technological culture. As if he were the living emblem of our own computer age with its technology for self-imaging, he clones himself. He presses the duplicate button on the machine. He makes himself visible to his consciousness. He possesses the entirety of himself. His desire to possess himself in its entirety is not so much anal retentive as cerebral retentive. It's to make the brain come into final, complete possession of one's own figure.